I've always feared the ocean. Not the surface with its calm waves and the hum of the wind, but what lies beneath. The true terror begins underwater, where the cold darkness reigns, where there's no light, no life, and you can lose yourself in the endless expanse, never knowing which way is up or down. That's why, when we descended into the deep, that primal fear resurfaced, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We were aboard the Cetus, an aging submarine, and though she had seen better days, her hull was sturdy, her instruments precise. But in the vastness of the ocean, none of that seemed to matter. We were a crew of 5. Captain Brunner, seasoned and hardened by decades at sea. Lieutenant Gale, the navigator, whose calm composure always reassured me. Roberts, the mechanic, gruff but competent. Stanley, our communications officer, and myself, an oceanographer on my first deep-sea mission. It was meant to be routine, mapping the sea floor near a newly discovered trench, deeper than any before it. The Cetus groaned as it descended. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. The faint hum of the engines and the occasional click of the sonar were the only sounds that broke the eerie stillness. Through the small porthole by my station, I could see nothing but the inky blackness. Occasionally, our floodlights would catch glimpses of alien creatures darting past, strange bioluminescent forms flickering for a moment before vanishing into the void. But something felt off. Even as we descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At first, I dismissed it as nerves. After all, this was deeper than I had ever been. The pressure outside the hull was unimaginable, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. I tried to distract myself with my instruments, focusing on the readings that flickered across my screens. But that feeling of being observed, of not being alone, persisted. Captain Brunner noticed the tension in the air and cracked a smile. "First time this deep, huh?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, feeling foolish. "Yeah, it's just so quiet. Gets to everyone the first time," he said, leaning back in his seat. "But you get used to it. After a while, the silence is all you hear." He turned back to his controls, and I tried to shake off the unease. But then it happened. A sharp jolt rattled the Cetus. The lights flickered, and the entire sub lurched to one side as if something massive had bumped into us. We all scrambled to our stations, adrenaline spiking through my veins as warning lights blinked red across the control panels. "What the hell was that?" Roberts shouted, his eyes wide. "Did we hit something?" Gale asked, already running diagnostics on the sonar. Captain Brunner didn't answer right away. He was staring intently at the controls, his jaw clenched. The sub steadied, but the atmosphere had shifted. The oppressive quiet was no longer just unnerving. It felt malicious, like something was waiting for us in the dark. "Sonar's picking up something," Gale said, her voice tight. "A large mass. It wasn't there before." I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat. A shape, indistinct but enormous, was lurking just outside the range of our lights. It wasn't moving, but it hadn't been there moments ago. "Whatever it is, it's just sitting there," Gale continued, her fingers hovering over the controls. Captain Brunner swore under his breath. "Keep the lights on it," he ordered. "Let's not take any chances." We all watched as the floodlights turned toward the object, illuminating the murky water. At first, it was hard to tell what we were looking at. A massive shadow, seemingly featureless, hanging in the depths. But then the details started to come into focus. It wasn't a rock formation as I'd hoped. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the ocean. The shape was massive, far larger than the Cetus, and covered in a slick, dark surface that seemed to ripple as the lights hit it. And then I saw it, an eye. A single, monstrous eye that reflected the light with an eerie, glassy sheen. It stared at us, unblinking, cold and ancient. I felt my stomach churn. This wasn't some deep-sea creature we'd read about in textbooks. This was something far worse. Something intelligent. Full reverse. Captain Brunner barked, but before anyone could react, the sub was hit again. This time, it wasn't just a bump. The Cetus was thrown violently to the side, and alarms blared as we were sent crashing into each other. The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked. My hands fumbled for the emergency lights, and when they flickered to life, I saw the horror in everyone's faces. Stanley was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Roberts was struggling to pull himself up, and Gale was frantically trying to restore power to the sub. But my eyes were drawn to the porthole. The eye was still there, inches from the glass, staring at us. And then, slowly, it blinked. It was watching, and it wasn't alone. The Cetus was silent except for the soft buzz of emergency lights. The air felt thicker, oppressive, as if the depths themselves had wrapped their cold hands around our vessel, squeezing tighter with each passing second. My breath was shallow, heart hammering in my chest as I stared into the abyss through the small porthole. That eye, vast and alien, was still there, almost pressed against the glass. It blinked again, slowly, deliberately. What the hell is that thing? Stanley's voice trembled. A hand clutched to his bleeding head. No one answered him. It was clear none of us knew. Powers down across the board, Gale said, her calm veneer cracking as her fingers raced across the console. I'm trying to restart the auxiliary systems, but it's not responding. Captain Brunner's face was pale in the dim light, a deep furrow between his brows. He was never one to show fear, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. Roberts, he snapped. Check the damage. What's our status? Roberts groaned as he pulled himself up, cursing under his breath. I'll get to the engine room, he muttered, limping toward the rear of the sub. His movements were slow, as if something was weighing him down. Not just the hit, but the oppressive atmosphere. I knew we all felt it, like an invisible presence creeping through the walls of the sub, watching, waiting. Suddenly, there was a sharp metallic thud from the outside. Then another. It reverberated through the hull and we froze. Something or things were moving out there, circling us, making their presence known. My stomach clenched with a primal fear. The ocean was a place of life, but not here, not at these depths. Here, life took on a different form, an ancient, unknown form. We need to surface, I said, my voice shaky. We have to get out of here. Captain Brunner shook his head, grim. We don't have the power for that right now, and we're too deep. The pressure would crush us like a tin can. He was right. At this depth, the water outside was as solid as concrete. If we tried to surface without proper control, the Cetus would implode before we even made it halfway up. We were trapped, thousands of feet below the surface, surrounded by darkness and something else. Suddenly, there was movement outside the porthole. The eye shifted, and something massive slid out of view. I strained to see where it had gone, but the lights only illuminated a narrow beam in the void. Whatever it was, it had moved out of range. Gale was typing furiously, trying to bring the systems back online. Come on! Come on! She whispered under her breath, her fingers shaking. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It wasn't just fear. It was something more primal, more insidious, like the ocean itself was turning against us. I glanced at Stanley, who was still pressing his hand against his bleeding temple. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I saw it, he whispered. His eyes met mine, wide with terror. There's more than one. I saw them when the lights flickered. They were everywhere. My skin prickled. How many? Stanley's voice cracked. Too many. Before I could respond, the Cetus shuddered violently again. This time, the sound of scraping metal echoed through the hull, as if something was dragging its claws along the side. A long, grating screech that made my teeth ache. Roberts! Captain Brunner barked over the intercom. What's the status down there? Static. Then Robert's voice came through, faint and crackling. You're not going to like this, Cap. There's damage to the propulsion system. Looks like something's wrapped around it. Wrapped around it? Brunner's face darkened. Yeah, Robert said, his voice growing shakier. I don't know how to describe it. It's like some kind of tentacle, but it's not a creature I've ever seen. It's alive, moving, A cold shiver ran down my spine. A tentacle? My mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was describing. The creatures outside, the things circling us, weren't just watching. They were trapping us, ensnaring us in the depths. Gale slammed her fist on the console. Damn it! We need power or we're not going anywhere. Another screeching noise reverberated through the sub, louder this time. Whatever was out there was tightening its grip. The walls seemed to creak under the pressure, the lights flickering again. Come on, come on, Gale muttered, but I could hear the panic rising in her voice. She was losing control, and so were we. Captain Brunner stood up, his jaw clenched. Gale, get that power back online. Roberts, cut that thing loose from the propulsion. We need to move now. Stanley was staring out the porthole again, his eyes wide and unblinking. They're coming closer, he whispered. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I turned toward the window and saw them. More of those massive, glowing eyes, floating just beyond the reach of our lights. They were moving now, drifting toward us like shadows in the water, their intent clear. They're not just watching us, I whispered. They're hunting us. The weight of the realization settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. We were prey, and whatever these creatures were, they had no intention of letting us go. Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, and for a brief moment, the interior of the Cetus was bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead lamps. Relief washed over me until I saw what the light revealed. Pressed against the hull, just inches from the porthole, was a face. No, not a face, something far worse. A grotesque, malformed visage with sunken, empty sockets where eyes should have been. Its skin was slick, a translucent gray, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It stared at us, unblinking, as if studying us with a curiosity that chilled me to the bone. And then it moved. The thing slithered away, disappearing back into the darkness, leaving a smear of something oily on the glass. But it wasn't alone. More of them were out there, hundreds, maybe thousands, their shapes writhing in the deep. We need to go, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We need to get out of here now. We can't, Gale said, her voice breaking. We're not moving anywhere until we can cut that thing off the propeller. Captain Brunner's expression hardened. Roberts, can you get it loose? Robert's voice crackled through the intercom again, but there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. Cap, I think it knows we're trying to leave. It's wrapping tighter. A long, slow groan echoed through the sub, the sound of metal bending under immense pressure. Whatever was outside had no intention of letting us escape. Then we'll cut it off ourselves, Brunner said, standing up. Suit up. We're going outside. The thought of going outside the sub, into the cold, crushing darkness, made my stomach turn. But Captain Brunner's voice left no room for debate. His decision was final, and as much as I wanted to protest, I knew it was our only option. We were trapped, pinned by something we didn't understand. If we stayed, we'd either suffocate or be crushed. Either way, we were running out of time. Suit up, Brunner repeated, his voice hard. Gale, keep trying to get power back online. Roberts and I will handle the propeller. Robert's voice crackled over the intercom, shaky but resolute. Understood, Cap. I'll meet you at the airlock. I glanced at Stanley, who was staring blankly at the porthole. He hadn't moved since we spotted the creatures. His hand, still pressed to the cut on his head, was trembling. I grabbed his shoulder, trying to snap him out of his daze. Hey, stay with me. We're getting out of here. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. They're waiting, he whispered. Out there. They're waiting for us. We're not going out there, I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. You and I will stay here. Let Brunner and Roberts handle it. Stanley's eyes darted around the cabin, then back to the porthole. They know we're here. They're watching us. His voice cracked, and I could see the terror gripping him. We're going to be fine, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Just sit tight. Brunner gave me a nod. You stay with him. Keep an eye on the monitors. He turned and headed to the rear of the sub, where Roberts was waiting by the airlock. I watched as they suited up in their bulky dive gear, the thick, reinforced suits designed to withstand the intense pressure of the deep. Brunner's movements were quick and precise, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that we were crossing a line we shouldn't. Roberts, pale and sweating, fumbled with his helmet before finally sealing it in place. The intercom crackled again as Robert's voice came through. "We're ready. Gale, keep us posted on the power situation." "Will do," Gale replied, though her voice sounded strained. She hadn't stopped working at the console, fingers flying across the controls. She was our only hope for getting the sub operational again, and we all knew it. Brunner turned toward me, his face half obscured by the helmet's visor. "We'll be quick. If anything happens, seal the hatch. Don't wait for us." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Understood." The airlock hissed as it depressurized, and a moment later, Brunner and Roberts stepped out into the abyss. The cabin filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional click of the sonar and the soft hum of life support. I sat next to Stanley, who was still muttering under his breath, his eyes wide and distant. Gale continued her frantic work at the console, the only sound in the room now the faint beeps of failing systems. On the monitor, I could see Brunner and Robert's suit cameras flicker to life as they stepped outside. The image was grainy, barely able to cut through the blackness of the deep, but I could make out their shapes as they moved toward the rear of the sub, where the propeller was entangled. The creatures, the things, were nowhere to be seen, but I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. "Captain?" Gale's voice broke the tension, crackling over the comms. "I've got limited power back. Not enough to move yet, but life support is stable. Keep me updated." Brunner's voice came through a moment later, strained. "We're at the propeller. It's bad. This thing, whatever it is, it's wrapped tight around the blades, almost like it's alive." I watched the monitor as Brunner shined his helmet light onto the mass. It was hard to make out, but it looked like thick, black tendrils coiled around the blades, pulsating faintly as if they were breathing. My stomach churned at the sight. "Can you cut it loose?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We'll try," Brunner replied, pulling out a small cutting torch from his suit. "Roberts, stay close." Roberts, visible in the corner of the screen, nodded. His breathing was heavy, audible through the comms. I could see the tension in his movements, the fear radiating from him like a palpable force. The torch sparked to life, its bright blue flame cutting through the darkness. Brunner moved it toward the tendrils, but the moment the flame touched them, the entire sub shuddered violently. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered. "Cap, what's happening?" Gale's voice was frantic, her fingers flying over the controls. "It's fighting back," Brunner grunted, his grip tightening on the torch. "Whatever this thing is, it doesn't want to let go." The sub shook again, more violently this time, and I felt my heart race. I glanced at Stanley, who was now rocking back and forth, whispering something to himself over and over. "Get us out of here," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Get us out. Get us out. Get us out." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the hull, followed by a low, rumbling sound. I looked up at the porthole and my blood ran cold. Outside, in the murky darkness, I saw movement. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly large. The creatures, the ones we had seen earlier, were coming back. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, drifting toward the sub like ghosts in the water, their glowing eyes fixed on us. "They're coming?" I whispered, my throat dry. "What?" Gale looked up from the console, her face pale. I pointed to the porthole, unable to tear my eyes away from the approaching horde. "They're coming." She followed my gaze, her face twisting in horror as she saw the creatures. "Oh God! Captain!" I shouted into the comms. "They're coming back. You need to get inside." Brunner's voice came through, strained and muffled. "Almost done, hold on." But there was no more time. The creatures were closing in, their enormous, grotesque faces looming in the darkness. I could see their pale skin, slick and slimy, their empty sockets where eyes should have been. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if they were toying with us. "Seal the hatch," Stanley whispered beside me. "Seal it now." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the control. If I sealed the hatch, Brunner and Roberts would be trapped outside. But if I didn't, a sudden thud shook the sub, and I realized it wasn't just the creatures' faces pressing against the glass. They were hitting the sub, testing the hull, searching for weakness. The groaning sound of metal under pressure grew louder, more urgent. "Seal the hatch," Stanley screamed, his voice cracking with fear. I slammed my hand down on the control, and the hatch began to close with a hiss. Gale turned to me, eyes wide with panic. "They're still out there. They won't make it in time," I muttered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding in my chest. As the hatch sealed, cutting off the outside world, I heard Brunner's voice crackle over the intercom one last time, distorted and filled with static. "They're everywhere." Then silence. The sub rocked again, and the lights flickered. Gale's fingers hovered over the console, but there was nothing more she could do. The systems were failing, and outside, the creatures were growing bolder. I could feel it, their hunger, their malevolence. We were trapped, and they knew it. Stanley slumped in his seat, his eyes wide and vacant, muttering to himself. Gale sat frozen at the console, staring blankly at the screens. The sub creaked and groaned under the pressure, the sounds of the creatures scraping against the hull filling the cabin with a horrifying symphony. And then, in the oppressive silence, I heard it. A slow, deliberate tap on the glass. I turned toward the porthole, my heart pounding in my chest. There, pressed against the window, was one of the creatures. Its empty, sunken eyes stared back at me, and in that moment, I knew. It was just the beginning. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. Its grotesque face, pressed against the porthole, seemed to leer at me with malevolent intent. The hollow sockets where eyes should have been were dark, yet I could feel it watching, studying. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought I saw its mouth twitch, as if it was attempting to mimic a smile. A grotesque, lifeless grin. The tapping on the glass grew louder. Then it stopped. A low rumble vibrated through the hull. The lights flickered again, this time dimming to an eerie glow, barely illuminating the interior of the Cetus. Gale's hands hovered over the console, her face pale and slack with fear. She wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing. "They're going to break through," Stanley muttered, his voice distant. "We're going to die down here." "No," I forced the word out, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The air felt thick, cloying with dread, like the deep itself was pressing down on us. Every instinct in my body screamed that we didn't belong here, that we'd crossed a boundary we were never meant to cross. "We're getting out of here." Gale's voice finally broke through the silence, soft but tinged with a strange finality. "We can't." I turned to her, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" "We have to try. The power's still partially on, we can." "It won't matter," she interrupted, her voice cracking. She gestured toward the monitor. "Look." My stomach lurched as I followed her gaze. On the screen, the external camera feed showed the surrounding darkness and the creatures. They were everywhere now, dozens of them, their pale forms drifting closer, swarming around the Cetus. The eerie, bioluminescent glow from their grotesque eyes illuminated their slick, slimy skin. Their mouths, wide and toothy, gaped open as if laughing at our helplessness. They weren't just outside anymore. They were suffocating us with their presence. One of them moved, pressing its face directly against the external camera. It blinked, its milky, hollow eyes gleaming, and I felt an icy wave of dread roll over me. These weren't just creatures, they were something much worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us, waiting for anyone foolish enough to descend this far. "We're trapped," Stanley whispered, his voice breaking. "There's no way out. We can't just give up." I shot back, desperation creeping into my tone. But even as I said the words, I knew Stanley wasn't wrong. The creatures were circling, closing in on us like sharks smelling blood. Another deep thud reverberated through the sub, and I felt the hull shudder. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if the creatures outside were testing the strength of our vessel, their long, bony fingers dragging across the metal. Gale's voice was barely audible. "We're too deep." I stared at the monitor, heart pounding in my chest, but the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to... My words trailed off as the horrifying reality of the situation hit me. Stanley was trembling, his eyes glassy with terror. "We never should have come down here. This place, it's not meant for us. They know we don't belong." The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, I felt a weight on my chest, like the ocean was squeezing the life out of me. Gale was right. Every second we spent down here, the pressure on the sub increased, and so did the likelihood that something would go catastrophically wrong. "We need to move," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "We can't stay in one spot. Gale, can we get the propulsion back online?" She shook her head, staring blankly at the controls. "The propeller, it's still jammed. That thing's wrapped too tight around it." "Then we cut it off ourselves," I said, glancing at the hatch. "I'll suit up and..." "No!" Gale's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and panicked. "You saw what happened to Brunner and Roberts. You go out there and you won't come back." I hesitated. She was right. The creatures were out there, waiting, watching, and hunting. Brunner and Roberts hadn't even had time to cut the tendrils before they'd been taken. Or worse, but I couldn't just do nothing. The sub lurched violently to one side, the sound of twisting metal filling the cabin. Something was pulling us, dragging us deeper into the trench. The lights flickered, and an alarm blared as the hull creaked under the increasing pressure. "We're sinking," Gale said, her voice barely audible. I grabbed the console, trying to steady myself as the sub groaned again. "Can you stop it?" Gale's fingers moved over the controls, but her expression was grim. "Not without propulsion." The sub tilted again, and I could feel the pull of the abyss below us. We were being dragged down, further into the depths, toward whatever lay at the bottom of this trench. I glanced at the sonar screen. The readings were erratic, but one thing was clear. There was something massive below us, something bigger than anything I'd ever imagined, and we were heading straight for it. "Can we cut loose?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. "Get free of whatever's pulling us?" "I'm trying," Gale muttered, her hands shaking as she worked the controls. "But it's like we're caught in something alive." The scraping sound outside grew louder, more insistent. I could see the creatures pressing closer against the portholes, their pale, twisted faces staring in at us, their mouths opening and closing in a grotesque mockery of speech. They were communicating, but not with us, with each other. Coordinating. Planning. The sub jerked again, and a sudden burst of static filled the cabin. The lights flickered, dimmed, then died, plunging us into total darkness. The alarms fell silent, leaving only the oppressive sound of the hull groaning under the pressure. "Gale!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "What's happening?" "I don't know," she cried, her voice shaking. "Everything's offline." Stanley let out a choked sob, his body trembling violently. "They're pulling us down. We're going to die here." My mind raced, searching for a solution, but there was none. We were sinking, the sub slowly descending into the depths of the trench, and whatever waited for us down there was far worse than the creatures outside. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered back to life, casting the cabin in a dim red glow. I blinked, trying to adjust to the eerie light, but something was wrong. Stanley was gone. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. He had been sitting right beside me, and now there was nothing. Just an empty seat, his harness hanging loose. "Stanley," I called, my voice trembling. "Stanley." Gale turned toward me, her face pale with shock. "Where did he go?" I didn't have an answer. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Stanley had been, my mind struggling to make sense of it. He hadn't left through the hatch. There hadn't been time, and we would have heard it. Then, slowly, I turned toward the porthole. Pressed against the glass, one of the creatures was there, its long, bony fingers splayed against the hull. and in its other hand, clutched tight like a doll, was Stanley. His lifeless eyes stared back at me, wide with terror, as the creature slowly pulled him into the abyss. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence of the deep. Gail clutched at my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to get out of here, now." But there was no way out. The creatures had us, and they weren't letting go. And then, through the static-filled intercom, I heard it, Brunner's voice, faint and distant, as if coming from the depths below. "They're waiting." The sub shuddered again, and I felt it in my bones. We were no longer just sinking. We were being dragged. The abyss had opened its maw, and we were falling into it. And something down there was waiting for us. Something far worse than the creatures that swarmed around us. Something ancient. Something hungry. As the lights flickered one last time and the pressure began to close in around us, I realized the truth. We had never been meant to leave. The ocean had claimed us, and it wasn't letting go.